everyone, and welcome to the final chapter of this math skills series on paging. So today we have a live Q&A where we can answer all of your questions around paging 3.0. So go in that chat and ask your questions. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. So I'm Florina Muntenescu. I'm a developer relations engineer at Google. And here with me I have...
Hello, my name is TJ. I'm a developer relations engineer at Google.
Hello, I'm Dustin. I'm a software engineer working on Android Toolkit.
Cool. So until you start asking your questions in the chat, we are going to start with some of the questions that we got previously on Twitter. So first question is, does paging recycle the items at the top of the list when scrolling a large number of items? And is there a limit to how many items paging will keep in memory? I feel like this is actually a two-part question. So first is around recycling items with a recycler view, and the other one is around paging, because paging does provide adapters to a recycler view, but doesn't actually handle the actual item recycling. But it actually does handle how many items we keep in memory. Who wants to answer how we do this?
I can do that.
Go, TJ.
So with the paging library, one of the things when you're creating a pager in the paging config is there's an argument called the max size. Now, if you do specify the max size, what paging will do is, like, when it's fetching data, as it keeps fetching data, it will make sure that it never keeps more than max size items in memory. So if you're worried about memory constraints or keeping too many things in memory at once, just specify exactly how many items you'd like to keep in memory with the large size parameter on your paging config before you pass it to the pager, and you'll be just fine.
Cool. Anything else to add, Dustin, or that's it?
I mean, yeah, no, TJ definitely nailed that on the head. I guess, like, to speak to your first part, when you talk about recycling, like, paging doesn't recycle the items per se. It just lets them deallocate and then allows you to allocate more new items as they load in. When we think of recycling, we think more of like reusing inflated views and stuff like that, which is more part of your view layer. So if you're using paging with recycle view will handle that for you. And similarly, like Compose has its own engine driving it as well. So it really depends on where you hook up paging with.
Oh, I like what you said there, because you said Compose, but you said Compose because paging also works with Compose, right? Paging Compose is in alpha right now?
Yeah, that's right. So we have a paging integration with Compose. It's still in alpha. We have a lot more kind of like API design and things we want to think about before we really bring it to like that stable. Yeah, I mean, we do have integration with Compose, so you can use paging with Compose.
I think this is actually a great segue to the next question. Someone on Twitter said, I've implemented paging 3.0 with a remote mediator and lazy column. So this means that they're using Compose. However, the list seems to jump into place when reaching the end of a scroll and requiring a network load on the next page. Page size is sufficiently large enough to cover more than the viewport. Help. What could this person do?
Yeah, I could probably take this one. So most likely what's happening here is whenever you load things with remote media, the way paging presents those items is through invalidation and then reloading. And the reason it works this way when you have layered sources when you're using remote mediators, because it's really important for paging to have a single source of truth. So that said, when you do run into this, it's usually having your paging Compose setup deal with invalidation properly, and usually you should do that with the keys argument. Whenever you present a lazy paging items within an items composable, you can pass in a keys argument that helps you match each item to a unique key that allows Compose to understand how to preserve scroll position.
Oh, thank you. Next question is, how do you use item after and item before? So I know that this is related to the placeholders, but before maybe we answer this question, TJ, can you tell me what's up with placeholders in general with paging?
Sure. So when you're fetching data with the paging library, you may have a situation where, like, fetching that data might take a bit of a time to show up. So typically you'd want to use placeholders. There's a lot of patterns people use. Sometimes people have like placeholders with a little shimmering effect. So it's kind of like a stand-in before your items actually show up. But one interesting thing about using placeholders with the paging library is you have to, give the paging library the page size so it knows how many items to expect. Otherwise, when you're using the item before and item after APIs, that's a bit deterministic. So make sure that it is fully configured to actually use placeholders before you attempt to use them. And yeah, that's pretty much that with placeholders. You kind of want to have stand-in data before the data you fetch actually comes in.
Yeah, so you can use page size only when you know exactly how many items you have. So either if, you are able to count them in a way, or if you're paging from the network, if your response also tells you how many items you have in total, right? Because otherwise you can't really use placeholders.
Right.
And then
you also do need to enable placeholders from the paging config side. So there is an argument called enable placeholders. But in terms of the question asking about items before and items after, those are arguments for the load result in your paging source. So that's just whether your paging source supports placeholders at all. And paging will ask the recycle view adapter or whatever view layer you decide to use to bind those items to as null items, essentially. So you get kind of like a null padded list with null number of items before, and then the loaded items, and then null number of items after.
Okay. Next question we got is, when coming back from a different activity, how does the one refresh pages that are not currently visible? So how do we refresh pages that are not currently visible when we're coming back from a different activity?
I can grab this. So when you say pages that are not current, well, I'm going to answer this in two parts in case, because I'm not exactly sure what you mean, pages that are not currently visible. But I can at least handle the refresh part. Now, when it comes to refreshing with the paging library, this is driven by your paging source and the invalidate method with your paging source. Now, it really depends on how your paging source is set up. If you have a paging source that is produced with room, just writing into the database, into the room database, will invalidate that paging source. New paging data will get emitted, and then the data that was there previously will get refreshed. Now, when you talk about leaving from one, you were in an activity, you left, maybe you went into another activity, you went in the background, and you come back, and you want to refresh that paging source. Again, it really depends on how so let's assume you're collecting the paging data from your pager as a flow. Now, if you were using the cached in operator, anything that invalidated your paging source, you don't necessarily need to trigger a manual refresh. That would just work for automatically for you. That's if you actually cached the paging data flow using cached in. Now, if your paging data flow was not cached and it was a cold flow, the minute you start collecting from the flow again, if there has been anything that invalidated the paging source, everything would just work. So again, when you talk about leaving from an activity and coming back to an activity, how do you manually trigger a refresh? The answer is, as far as refreshes go, it really depends on your paging source implementation. If you're using a paging source backed by room, it will be automatically invalidated if something writes to the database and you get your refreshed items. If you manually implemented the paging source yourself, you would have to invalidate your paging source, or trigger that however which way when your activity resumes. You would manually invalidate your paging source so you can actually get the refreshed items to show up in UI.
Yeah, to add to that, if you don't want to if your update is coming from outside your repository layer and it's just like a UI click or something like that, like a button that just says refresh and the user clicked on it, there are also the explicit refresh method that you can call on the different presenter APIs, like paging data adapter or the differ or lazy paging items, etc. So there is also that option too, but it's all driven by invalidation, like TJ said, and it's really important you do it this way because it's really, really important for paging to have a single source of truth, because it does a lot of work for you to handle things like config change. So definitely you should do it through invalidation.
The next question is also about loading. When I open first time the screen, the first page is loaded. But when I scroll on Recycle View, the next page doesn't load. But if I close and open again, the screen loads the page half automatically. What is the issue? I'm using remote Mediator in this scenario.
Could you repeat the steps again? I kind of got a little lost in the details.
Sorry. So when I open the screen for the first time, the first page is loaded. But then when I scroll on the Recycle view, the next page doesn't load. But if I close and open again, the screen loads the page half automatically.
Okay, I think I kind of understand what's happening. So my best guess here, it's hard to tell with like to help someone debug an app without looking at the code. But my guess is since they're using remote Mediator, what's happening is every page is loaded from network. And then as each page gets inserted into whatever data set is backing your paging source, you have to go through this invalidation loop. And it sounds like what's happening is through these invalidation loops, you're either not getting the next generation or you're not invalidating to trigger the next generation. So that's probably where I would look at first. So if you are invalidating correctly, like you're using Room and it's doing it for you, then pay attention to how you're collecting from that flow of paging data. Make sure that you're using something like collect latest, which will automatically cancel the previous generation and then allow you to submit the next paging data. And if you're not calling invalidate, then make sure you do call invalidate so that paging knows to generate another instance of paging data for you.
Yeah. Another thing to add to that is because they mentioned that when they opened it the first time, there was data, but when they scroll, there wasn't. So one of the things that are important when you're creating your pager in the paging config is the page size argument. So when you give that, typically we recommend that when you're passing the page size, make sure that the item that is at least should fill the viewport it should display like a full screen, full page of items on the screen. So just to make sure that, in the case when you're scrolling, you don't necessarily want to have to start fetching data when you're scrolling. You kind of want that data pre-populated for a good user experience. So another thing this person should try is they should also probably check what they're passing in as the page size for the argument, especially if they're using the remote mediator, they're making API calls, and each API call may take some time to actually fetch the data. You really don't want a situation where like every time you scroll, that's when you're fetching this data. You kind of want to like preempt that. So another thing that you check out.
But you have two configuration things, right? So you have the page size, but you also have, I think, the initial page size, which says like at the first load, how many items you should load, right?
Yes.
So that's probably first thing or that's also something this person should check out, given that they talk about the first page being loaded as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the other thing I'll add is like I'm also pretty active on like things like Stack Overflow or on Twitter. It's really hard to help someone debug an app without seeing the code. So if you're having trouble, feel free to just post a question on Stack Overflow and tweet at me or something like that, and I'm happy to help.
Cool. And then I think in general, like if you have problems with paging, do consider creating an issue on the official issue tracker. We'll make sure to link this in the description afterwards. And then if possible, link to a project that can reproduce the issue. I think especially with paging, when you have a library that's so big, it's really useful to have a project that can reproduce the issue.
Yeah, paging really does like traverse across a lot of layers on your app, like through repository all the way to the UI. So it's super helpful to have a repro project because a lot of times it's just a misconfiguration somewhere else. So sometimes it's not even related to paging. So
cool. Next question is, are there best practices or expectations for how talkback should behave with paging? Maybe I can try to take this one. Paging doesn't have anything to do with talkback because paging itself doesn't contain any UI elements. So paging works with Recycle View or with composables. Therefore, it's about how those views or composables handle talkback. So there are no best practices or expectations of how talkback should behave with paging. It should just work. Anything else to add? Or
yeah, I have no idea what talkback is, so I probably shouldn't mention that, but I have no idea what talkback is.
Yeah,
lean back integration. That's a different thing, yeah.
Oh, lean back. Well, that's I don't know whether you're actually seeing the questions, but the next question is related to lean back.
Okay. Okay.
Could you publish an example of two-dimensional paging that is common scenario with lean back? I've never worked with lean back myself, and never tried paging with lean back.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Yeah, that's actually a really good idea. If you're, again, maybe we can take notes or something, but like, if you're willing to like file a bug, it's definitely something I can forward to the lean back team because they own the paging integration there. So. Yeah.
Cool. So file a bug. Cool. Next question is actually kind of related to something you mentioned before. In what part of an app is it possible to use paging? And I think something we just mentioned before is that paging actually goes throughout your entire app architecture, because when we talk about something like the remote mediator or paging store, that's something that should be in your data layer probably. And then it goes all the way through your view model and connect to the UI. So there isn't one specific part of your app where paging should be used. I think we also have maybe some architecture diagrams, if I'm not mistaken, in our paging docs that explain a little bit better of how each paging component should fit in your app architecture.
Yeah, we also have like a nice diagram on d.android.com that kind of shows the different parts of paging and which layers they live in. Yeah, and the reason it's split up into layers is so that libraries like Room or SQLite can provide paging integration for your repository layer, and then you can just kind of use that out of the box with just the UI parts or just the view model parts with paging in your app. But yeah, I would probably direct you to something like that to figure out which classes you should put where.
Cool. Okay. How does scroll position restoring work? Is this related to paging?
I would say not. So like scroll position restoring is really down to the UI component that uses it. So Recycle View has a bunch of APIs for that. There's I forget the name of the API, but that tells you when the Recycle View should actually restore the scroll position, and you have a bunch of configuration options. You could do it after the first items appear, and so on and so forth. And as Dustin mentioned in a previous answer, when you want to make sure the scroll position of items are restored and consistent with Compose, you have the keys argument you can pass to the lazy list. So when you mention scroll position restoration in the context of paging, it's more about using the appropriate state restoration APIs in the UI layer and for the UI widgets to actually manage that sort of thing. Paging provides data for you to plug into your UI, but paging does not handle the restoration of scroll position restoration in your UI. Those UI widgets own that. That is intrinsically part of the state of the UI. It's not managed by paging.
Yep. Okay, how do we use the invalidate function? Can you tell me how to use it when we store data in memory?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can probably try and take this one. So if you're storing data in memory, usually that means you just have your paging source, and that just operates on some backing data set that's in memory. Well, I guess there's two ways to think about this. You can either think about in memory in terms of what paging is loaded, and in memory in terms of like you yourself tracking things in an array list or something like that. But I would always recommend to do the latter, where you're kind of tracking yourself in an array list. And the reason for this is the purpose of invalidate is essentially to let paging know when to reload data based on changes to your backing data set. And it operates very similarly to a refresh. And yeah, it's really important to make updates to existing items that have already been presented this way, because again, it's important for paging to have a single source of truth so that it can handle things like config change for you automatically. So I guess like to more like directly answer the question, it's if you have an array list backing your paging source, anytime you would change one of the items in the array list, that's when you call invalidate.
Maybe I can also add that the person asking this should also think about whether they want to store all of these data in memory. I think paging is great when you have like large data sets, but then if you're storing all of this in memory, like, do you really want to store all of this in memory? So do consider whether also using something like a database to store the data would work for you.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Okay, next question. Assuming I wanted to use volley and paging library with a single large data set, without making page requests to the server, what would be the best approach?
Without making page requests. So if your resource or your data source is not paginated, there's not really any reason to use paging actually. If you just have a single request and it gives you the full list, there's basically no reason, there's no benefit from paging. Paging is for like paginated sources where you actually have to make multiple requests to get incremental amounts of data added. But in terms of like integration with Volley and stuff, there are several different subtypes of paging source that you can use. So one is the base paging source, which is a suspending one with coroutines. But we also offer like a listable future paging source and a RX version. So that come with the dash RX or dash Guava artifacts from paging. So if you wanted to use Volley or something, you could just convert that into either a listable future or some kind of RX single.
Curious how you can use a database as a single source of truth while paging through ordered sets of data. Maybe I can start with this one, and then folks can add on. I think if you're using a database, then you're using Room, for example, then you're also writing a query. So this means that in that query, you can add whatever you want, including like a sorting order or filtering or stuff like that. The idea is that you just return the right type for paging. What else am I missing?
No, I mean, you basically hit the nail on the head there. Like you should definitely, if you're using Room, you should just do it through Room and let Room handle all your paging source implementation for you. And the way to do that, like you said, is to just use a SQL query that does sort it the way you want.
Yeah, exactly.
If the screen recreates, will it be okay to reload data from a remote mediator from the 0 position?
In the activity recreate method? Sorry, could you repeat that?
Sure. If the screen recreates, will it be okay to reload data from the remote mediator from the 0 position?
I think the answer to that really depends on the kind of user experience you're trying to give your user. I mean, in some cases, for example, if the user is scrolling through something and you recreate the screen, whether it's like you rotate the screen and other things like that, there might be an expectation to keep the user exactly where they were. And then, in some other cases, it might be fine to reload data from the 0 position. But I do want to kind of bridge the disconnect where like you recreate the screen, loading data using the remote mediator from the 0 position. The relationship between the remote mediator and paging is, if you're using a remote mediator, ultimately the remote mediator is going to be feeding some other paging source, right? The remote mediator is a callback. Anything you fetch in the remote mediator, the result of that fetch is never just given straight to the UI, right? It has to go through the paging source. So the question saying, is it okay to reload from the 0 position in the remote mediator is an interesting one, because when you fire up the remote mediator, you have the initial load, the remote mediator handles that, it passes it to its paging source, and so on and so forth. So coming back full circle, is it okay to reload data from the 0 position? It really depends on, one, if you were using your paging, when you created your pager, if you got the paging data flow and you cached it, when you recreate the activity, because it was cached, you're not going to be reloading from the paging data source, provided you're not going to be reloading again from the 0 position from your paging source. Now, if it wasn't cached and it's a brand new code flow, then you will recreate, since you're starting paging all over again, you will still be loading from the 0 position. The question, is it okay, is more or less, it's a UX question. It really depends on the experience you're trying to give the user. If you don't, if it's undesirable for you to start reloading again from the 0 position, please use the cached in operator. So like, the pager doesn't have to start again, because if the pager starts again, you will be loading again from the 0 position. If you don't mind starting over from the 0 position, then don't cache it in. But the question of, is it okay, should you, it really depends on the user experience you're trying to give the user. It's not necessarily an opinionated thing from paging as far as paging goes. Paging gives you what you tell it, what you define for it in the paging config, and however which way you set up the paging source.
Yeah, one thing I'll add, which might be another thing that the question is getting at, is remote mediator has an initialize method, which is guaranteed to complete before anything happens within paging itself. And the whole purpose of the initialize method is so that when you recreate your activity or whatever, and you essentially restart paging, Remote Mediator can go and figure out whether it needs to do a remote refresh or not. So if you have cache data and it's up to date and you don't need to refetch from network or anything like that, you can check that inside Remote Mediator Initialize method and then just return skip refresh. And then that will skip remote refresh if that's something that you want to do. But again, like TJ said, it's really up to the UX that you want to create.
Cool, thank you. How does Invalidate work on remote data, and how do you know which data to invalidate? Maybe actually, can we go a little bit more, one step back on this? I know, Dustin, you mentioned at one point something around generations earlier. Can we explain how that works and how invalidation works in
Sure.
general?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. It's also like really key to how paging works. So I'm glad you brought that up. So the way paging is kind of structured is around these kind of static snapshots of data. So whenever you have an instance of a paging source and an instance of a paging data, it's supposed to represent static data that doesn't change. And whenever those items do change, let's say new items get added or existing items are modified in some way, like if you're in a Twitter feed and you click the like button, then one of those items have to update to increase the like count, right? So when those changes happen, the way paging handles it is through a separate generation, creating a new instance of paging source and a new instance of paging data that will then get passed down through your pager that you can then collect from and submit as a second generation, to say. And the way to trigger those generations is through invalidation. So whenever whenever you realize that you're updating your backing data set, whether that's writing to a database, writing to an in-memory cache or something like that, you should call invalidate. And that will let paging know that, hey, this static snapshot that I thought I had is no longer valid, and I should throw it away, get a new instance of paging source, and provide a new instance of paging data to start reloading data to pick up those new changes.
But then if your data source is room, do you still need to call invalidate, or does room automatically know when the table was modified and it knows to call invalidate? Yeah,
so if you have a paging integration with if you're using paging integration through Room or something like SQLite, or often these libraries will have invalidation done for you. So you simply write to the database, and Room knows that because it's a paging source implementation that it's providing for you, it knows to invalidate that whenever you write to the database that way. That would affect that paging source. So no, you don't have to. It's done for you if you're using like some kind of existing integration.
Cool. And you actually mentioned the SQLite, and that's because I know we talk a lot about Room and paging integration, but we also have paging integration with SQLite, right?
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, we actually did end up talking to some people at Square about this, and they implemented it. So thank you for that. Yeet will probably kill me for mentioning SQLite a lot. Use Room, but yeah, we do have integration with them as well.
Yeah, but if you're already using SQLite in your app, do consider adding paging because now it's supported. Mm-hmm. Cool. Cool. Next question. I've been weaving paging through with asynchronous media queries via Media 2 to populate the media app. Are there any explicit integrations we can expect with the upcoming Media 3?
Oh, this is a great question because I've been working with the Media 3 API. So at the moment, no, there isn't. But if it's, I think for something like this, you could also consider filing a bug for it. Like if you think, pulling data with Media 3 is something that, it's a use case, like kind of give us details about what exactly it is you're trying to achieve. And then, we'll pass it along to the team to see if that's, something we can provide. But at the moment, there's no explicit, paging or Media 3 query API. There isn't one at the moment, no.
Yeah, this is the tough thing because we're not allowed to promise things in the future.
Yeah.
But yeah, the best way to do this kind of thing is really to file a feature request, like TJ said, and hopefully we'll edit the description to include the link to that.
You're not allowed to promise features because you know, Dustin, that you'll have to implement them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because there's only so much time in the world, so we have to prioritize. And it sucks if we say, hey, we'll do something, and we ended up not doing it because we ended up prioritizing something else. So yeah, file a feature request. It might not seem like it, but I do read every single thing that you file against paging. Sometimes it takes me some time to get to it, but someone does read it, and we triage it, and we get to it accordingly.
Yes, thank you. In a chat application, I need to support the offline message using room database with pagination. And then how can I remove or insert an item? How can I get item position in a page?
How could you repeat the second part? Because
I'm trying to decipher the question as well myself. Okay, so they have a chat application and they want to support offline messages using room and pagination. So how can they add or remove or insert an item? And then how can they get the item position in a page?
Okay, so there's kind of three parts to this question. The first part is offline messaging. So all of paging is powered through paging source. So any kind of data that it'll display or load is all through the paging source. So if your paging source is from room, then it's database driven, which is offline by nature. And you can essentially write to that database whenever you do network fetches through room Mediator or something like that, for example. In terms of updating data, so insert or not inserting, I think I forget the exact wording of the question, but I think they're talking about editing existing messages.
Yeah, removing or inserting items.
Right, yeah. So you would just do that by modifying the database directly, and then Room will handle invalidation and reloading the data for you. So it should just update the list automatically once you delete that item or that row from the table. And then there's a third part to the question, which was a bit more cryptic, I think.
Yeah, they wanted to get the item position. And I think the best way they can do that really is after they submit paging data to the UI, from the paging data adapter, you can actually introspect. You can actually get a snapshot of what's in there to actually introspect what's in the list to figure out the item position. But outside of that, Dustin, I'm going to hand it back over to you because figuring out the item position, it's really hard to define what that is when you have to know what you're trying to get the item position for, how you intend to get it at what part, what position in the pipeline you actually want to get the item position.
Yeah.
And whether does it matter on which position it is in the page? Why would that matter?
Yeah. My best guess, this is really reaching, is that maybe they're clicking into a thread or something and it wants to link to the middle of the list or middle of a conversation, and they want to start the initial load for the middle of a thread. So if you want to do that, and all your data is in a room table or something, currently the only way to really do it is to figure out the row position in that table. So you have to do a SQL query to figure that out. And then you can provide that as the initial key into your pager.
Agree. Yeah.
Okay. How can paging and temp memory on a virtual database work?
How can paging on what memory?
A temporary memory on a virtual database. So I guess with Room you can create an in-memory database.
Yes.
But then I guess in theory that shouldn't matter for paging, whether you have an in-memory database or not as long as your app is open, right?
Yeah, I agree. And when questions like this come, where how does paging work with so and so's data source? The answer is always, well, it depends on the paging source that backs that data source. We always refer to Room because when we use Room creates the paging source for you, so you don't have to do any extra configuration to get paging source. Now, if you have a custom data source, in this case, it said virtual memory or is it temporary memory, that again really depends on the paging source that you adapt that data source to feed, right? Because the main entry point for fetching your data with the paging library is, the aptly named paging source. So if you have some kind of interesting, esoteric, not very common, source of data, it's the onus then kind of falls on you to kind of implement the paging source that backs that data, and then everything should quote unquote just work, because the paging source is, you have all the abstract methods are defined in the paging source, implement those abstract methods, and the paging library will just, work from there.
Yeah, like paging doesn't care about the nature of the source of your data. Like as long as you can implement the paging source interface to load pages of data from whatever it is, whether it be from network even, doesn't matter. Yeah, the paging doesn't care.
Yeah.
I guess it's more for you to know that if you're using a virtual database, then it means that when you're closing the app and reopening, you won't have any data stored offline. So
exactly.
Your users are not benefiting from the offline support. Cool. We got another question about invalidation. Is invalidation a heavy operation? In the Twitter example, if I just want to change a single Boolean for is liked, am I going to re-render my entire list as a result?
So you shouldn't need to re-render the entire list. A lot of like view recycling that's built into like Recycle View or even like Compose should really handle that for you quite well. And because you're also only loading like a subset of your data that's going to be anchored around where your current scroll position is, it really practically, especially even if it's like reading from disk, it really does not have a big effect that we've seen. We do have an open feature request for supporting like self-updating pages, which has like a bajillion stars, which I totally see. But again, like that hasn't been prioritized like as the immediate next thing that we're going to do, because like we haven't seen that it is really that big of a performance hit to do the reload. So I don't know if that answers the I kind of forgot the second part of the question, but hopefully that answers the part about invalidation being expensive.
Yeah, and then if you just change a Boolean, will the entire list be reloaded or re-rendered? Sorry, and I think you've answered it because it depends on the UI framework you're using.
Yeah, it shouldn't. Yeah, it should not. Inflating views is expensive, but Recycle View handles that. So and Compose has its own engine running. So.
Is it necessary to use repeat on lifecycle when collecting paging flow? DJ, do you want to handle this one and also explain what repeat on lifecycle is?
Absolutely. So as everyone is familiar with, Android has the concept of life cycles, right? And the thing about life cycles is that it kind of tells you exactly what your app is doing at any point in time. Now, what the repeat on lifecycle API does is, like, there are lots of scenarios where I'm going to use a fragment, for example, where a user is in a fragment or a screen, and they leave that screen and they go to another screen. Now, because the screen that you just left, you can come back to it. It's not gone. It's it's still present in your navigation hierarchy, right? The life cycle of that screen will be paused and eventually stopped, but it's not destroyed. Now, while that screen is gone, so let's call that screen A. While you're now on screen B, if there's anything that is expensive that screen A was doing, either we're fetching data expensively, you kind of want to let go of those resources, right? Because the user cannot see those things. But when they come back, so they've left screen B, they're back at screen A, you probably want to start that thing all over again. So that's exactly what the repeat on lifecycle API is kind of designed for, where you want to, like, every time you kind of go in between this kind of, it's not gone completely, you can come back to it, but you kind of want to stop. That's what the repeat on lifecycle API is good for. When your lifecycle goes from resumed, it's paused or stopped, and you go back to resume. It's kind of like this cyclic thing. So it's just kind of going dormant and coming back. That is exactly what the repeat on lifecycle API is supposed to help you do. Now, the question was asking if you have to always collect a paging data flow with the repeat of lifecycle API. And again, the answer to this is it depends. Now, if your paging data flow, if you're using the caching operator, then by all means use, and when you leave, if you cache if you use the caching operator with the paging data flow, it'll keep that paging data alive. But if you're using the repeat on lifecycle API, cached in turns the paging data flow. It's kind of like a it'll cache it. So when you leave and come back and you use the repeat on lifecycle API, you're not really going to stop the paging, because paging is already it's kind of kept back cached ultimately. So again, the thing with this API is that it depends. Now, if you're not using the caching operator and you don't mind starting paging all over again, then yes, you can use the repeat on Lifecycle API. When you leave that screen, we'll stop paging. When you come back, you can start paging all over again. But again, it really depends on the experience you're trying to give, how you're trying to pull your data, and so on and so forth. But hopefully, I hope I answered what the repeat on Lifecycle API is supposed to help you do and why you may want to use it, because sometimes you actually don't want to stop doing something in the background when that screen is, especially if, for example, you're looking at a screen, that screen gives you a bunch of choices, it kicks you to another screen to select something and come back. In that kind of situation, maybe you don't ever want to stop processing everything that was on the first screen, right? So hopefully that kind of explains the repeat on Lifecycle API, the situation you may want to use it in, and that gives you enough context to kind of decide exactly what you want to do and how you want to do it. Because like most answers to most questions, the answer is always in the realm of it depends.
And I think if folks want to read more about the repeat on lifecycle, I think Manuel Viva, our colleague, has 1 or 2 blog posts about this that you can read.
Yeah, I guess if you're not sure, you probably should be using cached in and repeat on lifecycle. But there are some advanced use cases where you might opt not to do that.
Yes.
How can we use paging when working with nested lists consuming different API data sources? Oh, this is interesting.
This is like a weird question. Nested lists consuming different API data sources. Like, I guess like it depends a bit on how your app is set up. If you're talking about like having multiple lists where each list is like its own has its own paging setup driving it, that's a thing you can do. If you're talking about like nested scrolling, then I don't think paging really has an opinion on how nested you want to do your pagination or your scrolling. It just really kind of depends on what you want to do there. I'm not really sure I understand the question fully there.
Yeah, I guess it depends on like, I imagine this that you have like lists that are, I don't know, maybe infinite lists, and then inside it you might have other lists, but that ends up being quite complicated, and I don't know, also as a usability, I don't know how easy it would be for the users to understand what's going on there.
Yeah, I have some. I've seen some apps that do this kind of thing, and essentially you just have one paging setup for the kind of like main list that has all the sublists in it, and then I don't know if that's paginated or not, but if it is, then you could use paging to drive that, and then each individual sublist you could also have another pager flow to drive those as well. If the sublists share the same source but you want different transformations, then that's also something you can do with a single pager, and then you can multicast that using cached in to show for each sublist, and then you can apply different transforms however you want there. But if you want to like avoid loading pages of data more than once and it's shared, that's something you can do.
Thank you. Oh, testing. How do you suggest unit testing view models that have live data objects which contain paging data? With paging 2, you can easily access the data from a page list, but it seems like you don't have that capability with paging 3 unless you use some kind of adapter.
I guess I can take this one too. The reason there's no state inspection within paging data right now is because it really is just a wrapper around a flow of internal events. It doesn't carry any state. That state has to get realized in something like a presenter. And the reason we put all the APIs there for state inspection is because a lot of times you want the state inspection to happen synchronous with the UI. Like if you are, flipping a loading spinner on or off or something like that, you generally want to do that as the new data actually shows up, or when loading actually finishes and gets presented, and not like a couple frames before or something like that, which generally leads to flickering. So for testing, you do need to set up some kind of like base presenter API. And I know this is like something I'm keenly aware of, is that like it's a little bit more heavy-handed than it needs to be. So it is something we're looking at, but in the meantime, you do need something like an async paging data differ, or like kind of like a mock fake paging data adapter, and to just load your paging data into there using submit data, And then you can use the state inspection APIs like peek or snapshot on the adapter itself to look at what's been loaded. Yeah, I would also add that we have like examples on like GitHub and also on developer.android.com. So that's also a good place to kind of look for some cut and paste examples you can modify.
While using remote Mediator, how can we integrate save state to not refresh after process death? Would you be using save state, or would you just be relying actually on room, right? Because room would be the one that stores the data.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, I don't think there's any, at least certain, not easily. There's no way to get save state in a remote Mediator to start beginning restoring with that. So yes, like you said, Florina, like if you do need to, preserve something, then your database should be where you did it. However, if there's anything that save state, if there's some state that somehow has to be in safe state that you kind of have to pass into paging, the way you do this in your view model, you get a reference to your safe state handle, you read wherever you need from safe state, and you pass it in one of the parameters for the paging config before you create your pager after process death. If it's something that does not or cannot be passed into your paging config on something that is represented in your data itself, then that's a candidate for something that should be preserved and stored in your database.
The next question is why there is no Java paging sample for paging 3. Maybe I can try to answer this. I think we announced a while back, maybe 2 years ago, that we're going Kotlin first. So this means that the APIs that we're building, the samples that we're building are all written from the ground up in Kotlin. If you look at the library like paging is written from the beginning in Kotlin with like coroutines and flow being the backbone of the library. Therefore, having a sample and code lab in Kotlin just feels very normal. What paging has is kind of like adapters for that can be used from Java. So I know we have live data and RxJava, and I think what is it for Guava as well? We have an adapter. So if you want, then you can use the libraries from Java as well. But we see Kotlin and coroutines as being the main way to consume the paging APIs.
Yeah, we do have like small snippets of samples on d.android.com/paging. So there are like tabs you can switch between. But in terms of like a full app sample and a full code lab, those are in common.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Last question of the day. Can you add support for list expansion or collapsing? I mean, having a parent list item expand to show the child list items.
So this is an interesting question because that's a UI level thing, like where you have like parent, if you have like you have a list item, you tap that parent and then you have children come in. And then this is not where like, paging can certainly work with something like that, but it's not something that paging is going to actually like provide like a UI component for, right? Because that's a UI side thing. What paging is really great for is helping you load ordered sets of data from a data source that is big or even infinite, right? So if you do need to create, some UI where there's, you have an item, there's a, and that item has child items and so on and so forth, paging can already kind of work with that, provided each parent item has its associated pager that you can then page to its children of. But as far as like, a component that just kind of like you drag and drop, that's a UI component and it's not necessarily a paging concern.
Yeah, I agree there. It's kind of like a separate thing from paging.
Yeah.
Cool. Then that was it. Thank you everyone for asking all of these questions and for making us think and understand how to answer best your questions. I hope that went well. If you have more questions, I would say do hit us on Twitter. And also, if you have any issues with paging itself, create an issue on the issue tracker. Cool. Thank you everyone for watching and see you next time.
Bye-bye.